Okay, so the problem of unconsciousness. So I got a little bit inspired to this talk by something that I saw Keith Frankish share on Twitter. He shared a paragraph from Sean Carroll, where Sean Carroll writes that, like entropy and heat, the concepts of consciousness and understanding are ones that we invent in order to give ourselves more useful and efficient descriptions of the world. We should judge a conception of what consciousness really is on the basis of whether it provides a useful way of talking about the world. And I think this is a very fruitful approach to have when we approach such a difficult topic as consciousness. So what do we mean then by consciousness? How do we define it so that it's useful? And is it useful? So John Searle argued that we have two types of definitions, and others before him have probably used the same split between commonsensical definitions and analytical definitions. And commonsensical definitions being ones that describe or pointing to the phenomena in questions, while analytical definitions are at the end point of a scientific inquiry. So for consciousness, we are obviously not at the end point of our scientific inquiries. So one common sense definition is that consciousness consists of inner qualitative subjective states and processes of sentience or awareness, or as Nagel puts it, the what it isness. And consciousness, so defined, begins when we wake in the morning from a dreamless sleep and continues until we fall asleep again, die, go into coma, or otherwise become unconscious. And you've probably seen these definitions used in many papers from many different camps. And it's quite a pervasive way to, or used way to talk about consciousness to mean what we actually are trying to investigate here. So, but is this definition useful is kind of the question here. And I want to look at unconsciousness in particular. And I want to try to argue that not only is it not so useful, it might actually be a damaging definition. So based on this kind of commonsensical definition, we've created maps of different states of consciousness. We have, for example, the non-behavioral states where people generally do not respond to external stimuli or do not spontaneously react or do not show any goal-directed behavior. In this variant, that is a variant of the similar two-dimensional grid by Stephen Loris, we have the non-behavioral states down here, like coma, anesthesia, vegetative state, and the behavioral ones being wakefulness, drowsiness, and so on. And we can further kind of try to map these on a level of wakefulness or consciousness, where awake means that they show signs of wakefulness, like be eyes open and have like circadian rhythms, or certain spontaneous behaviors that not necessarily are mapped to any specific external stimuli in a predictable manner. And we can also map along a aware, non-aware axis where we are more or less aware of the external environment or internal experiences, like dreams, for example. And in this kind of classification, usually these states are classified as non-conscious or unconscious states, while these states up here are classified as conscious states. And of course, there's a lot of debate on whether that's the case or not, and where exactly the boundary is, if there is a specific boundary, if it's degreed or binary, and so on. But at least this distinction is pervasive in the literature. So we, of course, cannot really ask these people who are in a coma or general anesthesia whether they feel like something to be them in this particular state. We cannot really check to be sure whether they are dreaming or are actually aware of the operation. In certain cases, we do get reports that they have been aware of the surgery. Luckily, it's not so many, but on a worldwide basis, there is too much, I would say. And but we can instead measure their brain states to see if that gives us any clues to whether there's anything actually going on in there. And one of the reasons why we use study the brain is because one of the kind of assumptions, modern assumptions underlying consciousness science or neuroscience of consciousness. And we kind of assume that there can be no change in the mental states of a person without a change in brain states. Here, quote from Pinker. And similar to the supervenience that we heard about earlier today. But this is kind of like the modern operationalization that we work out from, that we can measure the brain and so infer from that the mental state. But we do not really have any proof whether there is like anything to be a person in a specific state unless they can actually tell us. And so we can't really prove the minds of other people. Consciousness is kind of difficult to study in this way. And we can call this by different names, but it's an epistemological gap. We can't really know what it's like to be someone else. And it's underlies the heart problem or the mind-body problem. And we kind of can't really map from the physical state of something to thus understanding exactly the phenomenological state. So what we do instead is we infer from the subjective report and goal-directed behavior of a system. We use that as our best inference to whether there is something there is like and what that might be. So if someone tells you that they're conscious, we tend to believe them. Unless it's a robot, then we don't. So if we can basically take the original creed, as I call it, and modify it, and we can add that there can be no change in the subjective report of mental states of a person without a change in brain states. However, this is kind of circular in a way that if we define conscious and unconscious as those states where people report or do not report that there is anything like to be them, then when we try to study consciousness and try to use this conscious-unconscious contrast, we find states where people report or do not report and use this as kind of like the empirical basis to trying to find these mechanisms that we're looking for. So this is kind of circular or like a self-evidencing circle of the vicious sort, as we heard earlier today as well. And so this is kind of like a little bit problematic, but you know, let's kind of ignore this for a while and ask rather the question, are subjective reports or lack thereof reliable tools of inference to conscious or unconsciousness? And specifically, is the lack of report a reliable tool to inference to unconsciousness? And I think this is a very important question because there are several cases in the literature of cases where we can doubt that the reports are actually reliable. For example, if we look at anterograde amnesia, in this case, from the diaries of Clive Waring, who is a British musician and conductor who suffered from anterograde amnesia, he couldn't form new memories and could only keep in mind the last 30 seconds or so. And over he would write, I am alive, I have finally woke up, I am perfectly awake. And he notes down the time, scratches it out, and perfectly awake again. And over and over and over. And it's sadly not a unique case, but we wouldn't say that Clive here is unconscious. When we ask him, he can report that he has conscious experiences right now. But if we ask him if he was conscious a minute ago or an hour ago, he would kind of stare blankly at you and say no, because he doesn't have any recollection of that at all. And similarly for the patient Henry Molaisen, another famous case, we can show that kind of like in his and other similar cases that the memory decays quite quickly. After 30 seconds or so, the kind of error rate in remembering some easy stimuli ramps up quite quickly. But of course, this decay is a discussed topic, and I provide a little reference here that you can follow if you want to look at some of that discussion. Another case from NetBlock is phenomenological overflow, as we also touched a little bit on in the discussion earlier, in which people who are presented very briefly with for example, a matrix of letters, and then asked to remember as many letters as they can. And they routinely remember 3 or 4 letters or so. But if you, after presenting this matrix of letters, then give a cue to which row of letters they should try to answer from, they can commonly return 3 or 4 of those letters, almost all of them. But if you ask the people who are taking these experiments, they would say that they do remember and do see kind of the whole stimulus, all the letters, even though they can't exactly name exactly which letters they saw. And so clearly that they cannot report exactly what they saw. They can report that they saw it, but not exactly what. And this, while maybe in this example it's not so problematic, it can be problematic in other cases where we do not really know whether they saw the original stimulus or not, and we can't really ask them. And there's been a lot of debate about the phenomenological overflow, but I think it's an interesting case to keep in mind. Another example, now we discussed blind sight a bit earlier today as well. And here, patients who have damage to the occipital cortex might report that they do not see anything, but if the experimenter asks them to guess, to give a forced guess, they will often guess correctly whether they see, for example, horizontal or vertical stripes, or which position a light is on. And while some would argue that this might be an indication of access consciousness without phenomenal consciousness, and we had a debate about that earlier today, and I might agree it might not be a good example of that. It's still an interesting case because it draws attention to a problem with how we design our experiments. If we imagine a similar experiment where the experimenter did not ask whether the patients see something, just ask, guess where you saw the light, or whether it's horizontal or vertical stripes, and the person will respond correctly, and from that the experimenter might infer that, okay, this person actually can see, because the experimenter didn't really ask specifically whether they had a phenomenological representation of the stimulus. So if we return to this question, are subjective reports or lack thereof reliable tools of inference to consciousness or unconsciousness? We can be, if we're going to be a little bit extremist here, we can say that the previous evidence shows that no, it is not reliable. Reports can be false or confounded by other processes, and so they are unreliable. Of course, that's a little bit on the extreme end, but if that's the case, then I would argue that we cannot really study consciousness as such. And by as such, I mean we can't really work on the hard problem of consciousness. We can't really figure out why it is that the brain produces a kind of phenomenological experience if we can't really contrast it with unconsciousness, because we can't really ask people and trust their reports. Now, this is, of course, a little bit extreme. But I think it raises the issue a little bit that we need to be more sure of our reports that we get. And we don't want to be solipsists. If we go a little bit too extreme in this end, we wouldn't believe that there are anything else than our own experience. That is not maybe so fruitful. And we might, of course, be critical of this no here, but maybe if we ask specifically about the lack of report, then it's a little bit more uncertain, I would say, whether the lack of report is a reliable tool of inference to unconsciousness. So we have to distinguish a little bit on the presence and the absence of subjective reports and their reliability. The other option then is, of course, yes, 100% yes. The subjective report or the lack of subjective report is 100% reliable as a tool of inference to consciousness or unconsciousness. I use report here a little bit interchangeably with goal-directed behavior. So subjective report in my sense doesn't necessarily have to be a verbal report, just to make that clear. So if we say yes, and I would say that a lot of the empirical scientists in the field of consciousness science do say yes to this, because if we look at the published articles of studies using, for example, the word unconscious and the word anesthesia in the same in the abstract of the article, we can see that there is a clear and increasing number of articles published using this combination, similar for unconscious and sleep, and also for unconscious and coma. So it's over 100 articles a year that kind of combine these terms. So unless everyone else are using these terms differently, then I'm kind of used here, unconscious being there's nothing there's like to be a system in this specific state, then I would say that the literature or the people in the field commonly use unconscious and anesthesia and sleep and coma kind of interchangeably. Another way to look at it is this is from a review that we're working on, where we categorize different measures of consciousness based on EEG. So in the past 10 years or so, over 255 different measures of consciousness based on EEG alone has been published in the literature. And that's quite a lot. And what we can see on this figure here is that each bubble represents a measure, and the size of the bubble represents how many articles use this measure. And the further away each measure is from the middle line indicates how consistent that measure shows a change relative to wakefulness. So down means that the measure decrease, up means that the measure increase. So for example, up here in this big blue ball up here, we have power in the delta frequency band, for example. So in states that we commonly assume to be states of unconsciousness, that means deep sleep, general anesthesia, coma, vegetative state, delta frequency consistently increases relative to wakefulness, while impulsive complexity, entropy, and similar measures routinely decrease, for example. And the reason why I show this is because what if these states are not categorized correctly? What if a general anesthesia might not be as unconscious as people often assume it to be, because we have this commonsensical definition that I showed earlier that indicates that this is a valid state to investigate the distinction between consciousness and unconsciousness. So one thing to note in this specific study here is that most of the studies referenced in this review did not really ask the people who woke up from anesthesia or sleep, a little bit difficult in coma and vegetative state, whether they actually had any experiences. So we don't really know. Yeah, so a preprint version is out for those who are interested, but we don't really know their subjective state. But if we do something like this is an image of the isolated forearm technique in which one applies a tourniquet to the upper arm and blocks the anesthetic from reaching, or the muscle relaxant from reaching the lower arm while giving anesthesia. And then you can ask the person who is undergoing anesthesia whether their name is Bob, or squeeze their hand twice if they can hear the experimenter's voice. And people routinely do this. They squeeze their hand in response and accurately. So in a meta-analysis from 2018, they show that between 18 and 64% of cases where they did this actually showed a consistent response. And I would argue that if you can show a consistent response to questions by squeezing your hand, it would indicate that you are conscious in some way, at least for those matters that concerns us. Of course, the number here would vary depending on anesthetic depth, on anesthetic type used, on the techniques, overall techniques, how you monitor everything, and so on. So there would be a huge variation depending on the experimental setup. Another case that you probably know of is this study by Martin Monti et al., where they had a patient who was classified as a vegetative state patient. And they showed that when they had this patient in the MRI and asked questions whether they could imagine, if they can imagine playing tennis and imagine walking about their house, they showed a similar brain response as healthy volunteers would do at the same question. And based on this, they could, in effect, create a communication device and ask yes, no questions. Yes for tennis, no for walking around in the house. And in a very interesting question, they asked whether the patient wanted to die or not. But it clearly shows that communication, and this would be an example of report, is actually possible even in states where we, at least on the outside, would assume the person to not be conscious. So the point of this is to show that maybe with even more advanced techniques than fMRI, maybe with some internal electrodes, for example, or future technologies that we don't know about yet, we might actually establish communication with people in different states that previously have been inaccessible to us. And so it might turn out that they actually can report or can communicate more than we would think. Another way to look at this is asking people when they wake up from sleep or anesthesia whether they recall any dreams or outside stimuli. So, for example, in REM sleep, we see about 70 to 80% of the times people will report having had a dream. And usually we classify REM sleep as a state of consciousness precisely because of this fact. So if you have a measure that scores high in REM sleep and high in wakefulness, but low in other states, then you would say that this would kind of conform to your hypothesis. Then you have ketamine anesthesia, which is usually classified as a state of consciousness for the same reason as REM sleep, because people who wake up from ketamine anesthesia routinely report having had vivid experiences and hallucinations, kind of like dreams. And so, for example, for those of you who remember the perturbational complexity index and their results, they had a high PCI in ketamine anesthesia and REM sleep. And they argued that basically this is because people have vivid experiences during ketamine anesthesia. The number here is between 70 and 90%. So it's quite up there. Then there is non-REM sleep. And this is a state which usually shows altered brain activity relative to wakefulness. And most markers of consciousness, like, for example, impulsive complexity, decreases. And as Camilo notifies here in the chat, yes, of course, it depends also on the concentration of ketamine, but I'll come back to that point a little bit. For non-REM sleep, we see this huge variance in report of experiences. And there are multiple reasons why there is such a big gap. One of the bigger reasons is how fast you wake people up and ask them. If you wait after they've woken up naturally and kind of get waking up to talk properly, then they might have not so much to report. But crucially, for general anesthesia, not including ketamine, you can see also a huge range of number of times you get a report. And of course, this varies a lot depending on the depth of sedation, methodological differences, even demographic differences. But one of the crucial factors is how fast you can wake people up and ask them what they experiences. And that might be, as we were touching on earlier, with the kind of decay of memory. Short-term memory is often classified as lasting up to 10 to 30 seconds without active maintenance of the contents of working memory, even though that's a debatable issue. But clearly that there is far more reports of experience than what we would normally assume given the commonsensical definition. So here's an interesting study from 1975. They looked at people who underwent ketamine anesthesia, and they saw that of 68 people who normally reported dreaming at home and having dreams during the night, 50 of them reported having dreams in ketamine anesthesia. But if you look at the 82 people who did not dream at home, who reported having no dreams normally, only 2 of those reported having dreams in ketamine anesthesia. So memory seems to be playing in a very important role, whether you report having had an experience or not. So let's come back to our original question here a little bit. I argue that if we can't trust reports or lack of reports specifically, then consciousness as such can't be studied. Of course, a bit on the extreme side. If you argue yes, then I think that the evidence that I've presented so far, and there's other evidence too, might suggest that with even more better techniques, better methodology, we might see that we might never truly be unconscious. Again, a bit on the extreme side, but it draws into question the common assumptions that we have that these states are actually exemplars of states of unconsciousness. Further, I might say that if you agree to this proposition that we might never truly be unconscious, then consciousness as such can't really be studied. One of the central tenets of modern neuroscience of consciousness is that we have to study the contrast between conscious and unconscious. And if we might never truly be unconscious, we might never be actually studying consciousness as such. But of course, that's a debatable proposition. If you disagree, we might actually truly be unconscious at time, then I would challenge you to find such exemplar states of unconsciousness. I will skip this little side note. We can discuss Ernst Mach's bucket later. So over to some solutions or some my suggested ways to kind of go from here. We might, of course, discuss the veracity of everything that I've said so far, but I hope that I've raised some questions regarding whether we should believe specifically the lack of report, whether that is a good inference to unconsciousness. So first, I would target the veracity of reports or lack of report. That's my first solution, is going to target there. The second solution is going to target, well, maybe even if we can't study consciousness, even if you agree to that, because of exactly this problem, we might come further along than we might think. And so I would suggest an option there. Third, you might not really agree that even if we're never truly unconscious, that's a problem. And so I would suggest something we can target in that way. And finally, number 4, exemplar states of unconsciousness. So maybe we can't necessarily prove that someone is ever unconscious. There might be something that is fruitful to do regardless. So I will go quickly through the rest. So validity of reports, I would say that we need to study how reliable reports actually are. We need to map out when and where and how do we get good reports that we can actually trust. So we need good paradigms like intermittent awakening from anesthesia or sleep to really ask people what they just experienced prior to waking up, instead of waiting until they kind of wake up naturally. We need rigorous methodology. We need clear-cut experimental paradigms to study this, especially in terms of anesthesia studies, which have very varied methodology, and they don't oftentimes not even ask people whether they had an experience or not. We need to really investigate what people experience. So, for example, we talked a little bit earlier about aphantasia and whether their mind was blank when trying to visualize something or not. But if we do not really ask in the right way or probe deep enough, we might not really know whether there's something there's like to be aphantasic and trying to, for example, rotate figures. Maybe it feels like something is just normally doesn't pop up because we're so used to talk in visual terms. So in other words, we need to really ask the right kinds of questions. mind reading is a second suggested approach. So this would be similar to the Analset's approach, where we try to kind of map specific parts of phenomenology to specific mechanisms, or in essence trying to decode the brain. I was going to show a video here, but since I'm slightly on overtime, I will skip this. Basically, this is a study from 2013, which is very interesting, showing that we can basically decode the content or the rough character of dreams and show that that matches up very well with the report afterwards. But I will skip the video because it takes a couple of minutes. But I would say that trying to decode what we're actually experiencing and kind of correlating that with subjective report of experiences, or people rating whether how closely the decoding aligns with their experience, that's a fruitful way forward, I think. As a bonus, it can also strengthen the question one, the report reliability. So we can kind of multiple pronged attack. Third, even if we're never unconscious, we might say that, well, consciousness can be a graded phenomena, so that we don't really necessarily have to investigate the binary proposition, but we can investigate the continuous proposition. Of course, this has also problems of its own. What does exactly a graded consciousness mean? What does it mean to be less conscious or more conscious? What does that actually entail? But there's several kind of paradigms, schools that goes in this direction. For example, IIT, which says that we have can have kind of more or higher phi, but exactly what that entails and whether that's an important distinction or not, that's open for debate. But it's at least an implication, even though I know it's not necessarily amplified so much in the later parts of IIT. But here we can kind of attack consciousness as more multidimensional, more graded, and less all or nothing. But that would also entail kind of moving away from the original definition of something there is likeness, because that, at least on the intuitive sense, has a very binary feel to it. Finally, instead of trying to find states that we say that are unconscious, because it's very hard to actually prove that someone are unconscious, we could try a multidimensional characterization approach. So here's a very simplistic example of how that could be done. We could, for example, classify different states along multiple dimensions. So for example, anesthesia, there would be no spontaneous behavior. There might be some goal-directed behavior through the isolated forearm technique. There might be direct subjective report, again, through the isolated forearm technique. You might also get retrospective report through the intermittent awakening paradigm. And we are really unsure whether there's any connected awareness, even though our intuition tells us there's none, but we don't really have any evidence for or against. So this would be kind of like a positively confirmed, cannot be negatively confirmed, very simplified. So kind of like a short summary, and I will leave this in the background, and I will end my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre.